Good evening and welcome to Talk of the Stacks. I'm Christy Pearson with Friends of the Hennepin County Library, and I am joined by Library Director Scott Dimstra. Welcome, Scott.
Oh, thank you, Christy. Thank you. Thank you for the applause. I am thrilled to be here for the first Talk of the Stacks of 2026, and a special hello to, there's a number of you in the audience, but there's a number of people who are attending online via the live stream as well, too. So for those of you attending online at home, we're so glad to see you as well.
Almost.
Yes, exactly.
Now, in just a few minutes, James Beard Award-winning Shawn Sherman will take the stage.
Yes. But before we begin the program, on behalf of the library and the Friends, we'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that in Hennepin County, we live and work on the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Dakota people. Today, the continued effects of colonization and oppression are felt locally by Indigenous communities. By offering this acknowledgement, we commit to recognizing Indigenous nations and to the work of reconciliation. In demonstration of this commitment, recent library initiatives and partnerships with local Native American communities have included the expanded Makoche Indigenous collection at our Franklin Library, the display of new Dakota land maps by artist Marlena Miles with language by Dowie, rolling out at all 41 libraries within the next 2 years, and our current Mary Ann Key Book Club selection of The Serviceberry by Robin Wall Kimmer, including an event here at the Minneapolis Central Library in this room on May 13th.
So mark your calendars and sign up. Thank you, Scott. Well, we'd next like to thank our generous sponsors. Many thanks to LSC Architects, Nor Companies, and the Minnesota Star Tribune. So let's give them a hand. Now, since we were last together in November, the library has received some exciting news, and we have also faced some challenges. But first, the good news. 2025 was another record year for Hennepin County Library. We had more than 580,000 library card holders check out a record 12.8 million items from the collection. Pretty impressive. And that's not all. We had nearly 5 million visitors to our 41 libraries. So pretty incredible.
Amazing.
Now, we also have, these totals show that our library is more essential than ever. And it's just one of the reasons why we at Friends have increased our annual funding commitment to the library from last year's $2.5 million to $4 million this year. And I know we can make it by the end of December. But with all of these successes, we as Minnesotans have struggled through a very difficult period these early months of the year, as so many have been affected by Operation Metro Surge. Now, we've seen how many of you have stood up for each other and for your neighbors, especially our immigrant, refugee, and Indigenous communities. And we want you to know that the library is here for you as well.
Thank you, Christy. And at Hennepin County Library, we believe that hope resides in our shared humanity. We know that our community is stronger when we invite each other in, when we share a space like a library, when we lean in with curiosity, and we find commonality across our differences, age, and experiences. The actions that our library has taken in the last couple months fill me with hope during these challenging times. Through a robust community network and staff at all 41 libraries, we are currently focusing on expanding services for patrons who don't feel safe leaving their home and coming to our libraries. From book deliveries to virtual tutoring to expanding access to information and services in Hmong, Oromo, Somali, and Spanish, the library has acted quickly to ensure patrons have access to books and resources they need. We have even moved beyond our traditional services by offering food and hygiene kits at many of our libraries. Simultaneously, staff are planning for the important long-term work of rebuilding trust, community connection, and providing critical literacy and employment support for our communities. Together, we can prove that a library isn't just a building. A library isn't just a collection of books. A library is a community united. Thank you. And I know for some of you, you've heard that message before. Christy and I are proud we can actually make it through that message without cheering up because We truly wear our heart out on our sleeves and truly are dedicated to the work that we provide in our libraries as well, too. And I want you to know that this is just the beginning steps towards the future for the library as well. We are committed to the ongoing work of making our communities feel safe, but most importantly, to feel respected again as well, too. And that we will be there with you every step of the way. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. And thanks to the support of all of you, we know we will begin the long process of bringing back the joy of books, learning, and connection to the Twin Cities. So thank you, and thank you for being here this evening. And now it is our pleasure to introduce our special guest. Shawn Sherman is an award-winning chef, educator, author, and activist. A member of the Oglala Lakota tribe, Sherman is a leading figure in the Indigenous food movement. He is co-founder of the celebrated Minneapolis restaurant Owamni and the nonprofit Natives, a 3-time James Beard Award winner, and was named one of Time Magazine's most influential people of 2023.
I agree. Let's
Pretty impressive.
Sherman's latest book, Turtle Island, is among the most comprehensive works to date on the food traditions and legacies of Indigenous peoples across North America. Co-written with Kate Nelson and Kristen Donnelly, the new book exemplifies how Native foodways can teach us all to connect with the natural world around us. Of the new book, best-selling author Robin Wall Kimmer raved, "I've been completely seduced by Shawn Sherman's Turtle Island. This is so much more than enticing recipes and gorgeous photos." Please join me in welcoming the incredible Shawn Sherman to Talk of the Stacks.
All right. Thank you, guys. All right. Well, it's been January was such a long year, you know. From the restaurant perspective, it was pretty crazy, and I'm just glad that we're able to gather and to have these situations, just be together as community, to enjoy each other's company without the fear of being violence, probably just moving across town. And so thank you guys so much for coming out tonight. I'm going to jump right into it because I'm going to go through what's typically an hour and a half long speech in about 30 minutes. And so I'm just going to go through and give a lot. Some of you may have seen me talk before, so it's kind of an iteration of what you may have seen, but it's a lot of important information. And we're just really excited that Turtle Island is live. It's out there to the public. And that it was quite a few years of work and experience to put that together, to look at all of North America, removing colonial borders and looking at the Indigenous diaspora of Indigenous diversity that lives across the whole continent, you know, from Mexico through Alaska. So there's so much more that we have to learn. There's so much more that we have to make normal in our own daily lives, utilizing the knowledge of our Indigenous communities and our ancestry who have treated this world so special, you know, because one of the common traits of Indigenous communities everywhere is just that connection to land, that connection to plants, the connection to animals, and just that reciprocation that comes, that symbiotic relationship of being a part of the environment, you know, not above it, but just being with it. And so we have a lot to learn, and there's a lot of challenges in front of us as humans. So for me, I'm just really excited that I am able to still do these talks with people to promote this book. I felt like partway through January, I was like, oh yeah, I have a book out because our whole reality had changed so drastically. And so I'm just excited that we can be back on stage and talk about something that we feel is really special and really wonderful. And I know that we can trust Minnesota and the Hennepin Public Library that this book will not be banned here. So I can't promise that in Florida, however. So anyways, so a little bit about myself. I was born and raised on Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, which is the third largest reservation in the United States. And it's also, you know, it's been the poorest area in the United States ever since its inception. And so for me, growing up Lakota, you know, it was a lot of open spaces, you know, because I was born in 1974. right after the AIM uprising that happened out there on Pine Ridge, which was 1973. And, things have always been difficult on the reservation. They were never built to be easy, and they still face a lot of challenges. There's still, close to 70% unemployment on Pine Ridge today. There's still a lot of lack of food access, and that's a lot of what drives me to do this work, because this work was never about me. This work was never about the ego of a chef. This work was trying to make something different and better for the next generation. So kids growing up on the reservation like I did, I can only hope that they will have more information about their culture, access to their foods, access to health. And so for me, like, the work started with just, growing up as a kid on the reservation. We were, I think parenting was pretty loose in the 1970s. And I think it was even a little bit looser on the reservation. So we were rather feral growing up. And, I think that I remember, for instance, we'd be a pack of these kids. We'd spend all our time outdoors, because one of the only rules of parenting in the 1970s was stay the fuck outside until dark. That was pretty much the rule, And you better be home at dark too. And don't get hurt, because that's your fault. And so we spent a lot of time outdoors. And I remember, we'd be running out the house with 22s and stuff. We'd be 6, 7, 8, 9. And our parents where are you guys going with those guns? We're we're going to go shoot stuff at the dump. They're well, bring the dogs with you. And that was just an example of parenting in the 70s also. And so I don't know what the dogs were going to do for us, but it just seemed like the safer option, maybe. I don't know. At least they were attentive. But, so I enjoyed my childhood, and I wouldn't trade it in for anything. As growing up with that much freedom outside, our imaginations ran wild. We, come from a generation where we just learned to take care of ourselves a little bit. And it was great to be that close out there. And so my mom moved my sister and I off the reservation in the mid-'80s, and we moved to the Black Hills, and we moved to a small town called Spearfish, which is in the northern Black Hills. And I started, it was right before I started high school, and I started working in restaurants when I was only 13 years old out there, because South Dakota didn't care how old you were to work, especially wash dishes. And so I was just, in the kitchens doing my thing and learning, and I just did that restaurant work all through high school and college. I went to Black Hills State University, which was also out there. And I had a little stint of working in the U.S. Forest Service right out of high school, which was a cool job, because my job was a field surveyor, so I had to go up in the hills, and they would give me, back then, an aerial photo map, and I'd have to look at the acreage, and depending on the acreage, would put so many plot points, and I'd have to go those exact points using just a compass. And then so the job also, I had to learn the names of all of the plants and trees in the Black Hills. That was the job. And so that came in really handy much later in life, of just realizing just how much amazing information can be found in an understanding of plants and botany. And so that really helped me later on in my journey. I don't know why they would give the keys to a Forest Service truck to an 18-year-old in South Dakota, but that's what they did. And it was good. It was a great job. But, I continued to work restaurants, and I actually moved to Minneapolis shortly after college there. I moved here in late 96, early 97, and I really didn't know anything about Minneapolis. I thought it was a clean city. I knew that Prince and the Replacements were from here, and that was almost my extent of knowledge of what was going on in Minneapolis. But I really I was in my young 20s, and I enjoyed the music scene. There was so much happening at the time. It just felt like a very hip city, and it still does, And so I just really enjoyed being, growing up here in that phase of my life, and working restaurants. And so I became a young chef in Uptown. I think I was barely 27 when I got my first chef job, and it was at this little spot on Lake and Lindale called La Bodega, and it was just a little tapas bar, not topless, but tapas. And and it was hot at the time. We had flamenco dancers, and it was popular for a moment. And it just kind of started my career, so I just kind of jumped into being a chef. And I didn't mean to be a chef. It just kind of happened to me. And I don't recommend it. It's long hours. It's a lot of work. But, it did serve me. And so, so it It was a few years into that chef career when I realized my own calling, because I realized the complete absence of indigenous foods out there in the world. Because I realized I moved to Mexico for a little bit because I just got a little burnt from the restaurant industry, which what happens when you're a chef sometimes. And I moved to the west coast of Mexico in the state of Nayarit, and I was living in a little bitty town called San Pancho, and this was around 2006, 2007. And I was just kind of hanging out down there and considering, like, what do I want to do next? What should my focus be? Because I had a pretty good chef career at that point. I was still pretty young, but, I'd worked sushi. I learned, we have so much cool food here. I learned about Ethiopian food. I knew all this stuff. And I realized that I could name hundreds of European recipes off the top of my head, but I knew very little about Lakota recipes. And I even knew the European languages. Like I could name all of those all those ingredients and recipes in those languages, in French and German and Spanish and Italian and all the things. But I just didn't know anything about Lakota food. And so when I was down there in Mexico, I became very curious with the indigenous community down there, which were the Huichols. And the Huicholes were, I saw this amazing commonality of being indigenous because they had very similar artwork. Their beadwork is amazing. Some of you may have seen some of those Huichol art pieces that are just these intricately beaded pieces. They're just amazing stuff, and they have really rich mythologies and religions and things like that. And we had all this commonality as indigenous peoples of deep connections to plant spirits and animal spirits and the earth and all of these things. And it just kind of opened my eyes, and I just realized that we were all just kind of cousins, we were just from different parts of North America. And it got me curious to be thinking about, like, how come I had studied all this food from all over the world and never really thought to even thought to look at my own heritage, and what happened? Like, why did I grow up on Pine Ridge, and why was there no native foods there? And so that was the eye-opener for me to start going down that path to learn, because I knew what I grew up with wasn't native. I knew that, Jell-O molds weren't native. And I used to always tease I couldn't just order Joy of Native American Cooking online. So I had to write that one, basically. And so it just became the question for me, like, what are pre-colonial foods? What does it mean to decolonize? And why is this important? Why is it even, why should we even understand what indigenous foods are? So there's a lot of things, but, as indigenous peoples, like, we have vibrant native communities all over the United States. We have amazing native communities right here in Minnesota. And we have so much legacy and ancestry, but all of us had gone through a really difficult situation of colonization. All of us as indigenous communities, especially in the United States, have faced a lot of loss of our own culture, a lot of loss of access to our own foods and knowledge of our own foods. And we've been able to maintain some things. Here we started maple season, for example, right now. And we obviously celebrate our beautiful wild rice. That if you're from Minnesota, you know the difference between true Minnesota wild rice and the black California stuff. And so it's, but we still lost a lot, and so it became I had to understand history, so I had to learn a lot about American history, and that's what this talk really kind of goes into, is just understanding, like, what does it mean to decolonize, So I like to start from the beginning. So to really understand what it means to decolonize, you have to understand what is colonization, what is colonialism, and the easiest way to understand colonialism is just to Google it. So if you Google the term colonialism, you'll get this description: the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers, and exploiting it economically. This is something that is not unique to North America. This has happened across the globe, and we're still seeing forms of colonialism happening all over the globe. You're seeing it in Congo consistently. You're seeing it in South America, all over Africa, for example. You're seeing it in the Middle East. You're seeing it in Palestine. You're seeing it in Gaza. You're seeing it in Ukraine. Colonization is still very active in today's world, and the United States is still a perpetrator of colonization and colonialism still today, of trying to take over other people's land spaces for the sake of their resources, for the sake of capitalization. It makes some people very, very rich. And so it's just something that we should be getting away from at some point in human history, but we're not there yet, and we have a ways to go. But the more we educate ourselves, the more we could see through this, and the better we can see a better future if we continue to educate ourselves, which is why on some side of things, the people who are perpetuating colonialism and colonization, they don't want that education out there. They don't want you to learn those histories of what happened, especially in places like the United States, of how the United States became a global power, but not talking about because of the theft of indigenous land spaces and also utilizing indigenous labor by stealing people from a different continent completely and forcing them to build so much. And so there's a lot to talk about in U.S. history, and history can be painful, but it's history and we should all know it no matter what. And it's just a part of it, because all of American history begins with indigenous histories, so there's no reason to remove indigenous histories from our textbooks and from our curriculum, because again, it's just a part of the story of the land that we're on, and indigenous histories go back much, much further than European immigrants, and so there's so much to learn. And again, like, the more we connect with indigeneity and indigenous knowledge bases, the more we can live more symbiotically with the land spaces, and because we are going to go through some challenges with climate change, with water crisis, all of those things are happening in real time, and we need to find better ways to consider how we're more resourceful, less wasteful, pollute less things, not rip up our environment for the sake of foreign companies to make a buck. That's why we need to be protecting the boundary waters, for example. It's not a matter of if those pipelines leak, it's a matter of when and how much damage will they do, and will that damage last for generations? Will our grandchildren have access to beautiful Minnesota wild rice or access to the beautiful land space? So in American history, we're a very short story, because we become a country in the late 1700s, which isn't that long ago. And, at that time period, we're just a few colonies hugged up against the East Coast, basically. And the reality of what's going on in North America is the vastness of North America, which is a massive continent, is still stewarded by indigenous peoples, even at the year 1800. And even despite European countries claiming vast areas of land spaces, there's still indigenous peoples living there, And there's a lot of diversity across North America. And, we're pictured as savages, we're pictured as all these things, but we had amazing networks of trade, of agriculture, of science, and all sorts of things happening in different areas all over the place, And so we don't even really form our borders until the middle of that century, until 1848, when the Treaty of Guadalupe defines what is that southern border that we see today of Mexico. But we have to remember, that is a very short history, because at the beginning of 1800s, the year 1800, basically, probably over 80% of the land mass is still stewarded by indigenous peoples, but by the end of that century, by the time 1900 hits, less than 2%, only because of the reservation systems that were set for us as indigenous peoples in America. And it's really aggressive because the United States really pushes, with Indian Removal Act, and California wipes out its entire indigenous population almost to completion just between 1850 and 1865. They do a census because they had legalized bounty systems. You can make upwards to $200 for the body part of an indigenous person in California. Think about the inflation rate of how much $200 was worth in 1860. And so California, they do a census in 1873, and they count less than 14,000 indigenous peoples left alive after there had been hundreds of thousands of them living across that really beautiful area because it was so livable. You can grow all year round. There's just so much, and there's so many tribes and languages in that one area alone. And that's just, our government right off the bat, they dehumanize us. That's just part of colonization, is dehumanizing the people that live there to get at what they're after, which is the resources. And for us as indigenous peoples, the main resource that we had was land space. And the United States knew that the more land it took over, the richer it would be. And that's what basically our first presidents were doing, the founding fathers, because they were illegally land surveying before they started the United States, before they did this Declaration of Independence, which is the breakup letter with King George at the time. And so What was really damning in their structure was called the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, because this was the document that justifies the land theft, and how they aggressively move forward with it and set their sights on the from coast to coast for the rest of that century. And so when you fly over the Midwest and you look out and you see those perfect little grids, that's a direct result of that particular document, because it shows them how they acquire land spaces through whatever means necessary, and then they're able to commodify land spaces to make money, which is the United States becomes extremely rich extremely fast, because it just steals a massive amount of land space from many different Native communities. And that just kind of sets the tone for how leaders in the United States treat Indigenous peoples, because we see Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act of 1830. We see the Homestead Act of 1862, the Morrill Act of also 1862, which creates the land grant universities. And our land grant universities are still profiting off of stolen land spaces from that time. So they really should be called land grab universities, because every state has one. And we also see the Dawes Act of 1887, and these are just examples that you can read further in history of ways that the United States government was just justifying the theft of land spaces. So during this theft of land spaces, we see a massive amount of loss of food access for our Indigenous communities. Some of you may have watched the Ken Burns documentary on the American bison, and he dips his toe into some of this history, but this was a very intentional destruction of this animal for the sole purpose of hurting the Indigenous communities that were thriving off of this animal, because they're using it for lodging, for tools, for food, of course, for all sorts of things. And it's not too hard to go back into history and find a documentation to prove these facts, because that was just their purpose. Because they actually had like talks in Congress was it going to be? They were arguing whether it was going to be easier to just genocide everybody or to go another route, and they chose this other route of first taking out the bison and then moving towards assimilation. So that was another part that really hurt us as Indigenous peoples, was the eradication of our own education systems, because we had countless generations of knowledge of how to live sustainably in these land spaces all over the place, from the Arctic to the tropics. And we had so much valuable knowledge of what to do with how much, so much amazing plant diversity to utilize, how to make natural medicines, and there's just so much knowledge that was wiped away. Because towards the end of that century, they basically decide that they can assimilate the Native communities. And so basically, this is my grandparents' generation now, born at the turn of the century, because they take these kids who should have been downloading these countless generations of amazing knowledge, and all this knowledge is replaced with something completely different that has nothing to do with them or their cultures. And so these assimilation efforts, basically, it was just kind of a trick, because they just kind of changed their clothes and they're using photography to see what we did to this young Native person, But really all they're doing is they're just granting this generation a massive amount of trauma. Because if anybody's ever been to or studied Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania, this was the first of the boarding schools, and this picture has hundreds of children from all over the United States, from different communities and tribes all over the space, and they're speaking many different languages. There's many different religions in there, but they're forced to speak English. They're forced to learn about Christianity. They're forced to learn basic duties, and this is a military-run school, and so this was not a fun place to be at all, and a lot of kids perish here because they're not only faced with a lot of physical abuse and mental abuse and sexual abuse, but also death. And there's still a massive graveyard at Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And these boarding schools happen all over the place, where there's Indigenous communities. And Deb Holland's team did a really good job of breaking down a report of just starting to peel back the layers of what actually happened during that time. But of course, that work has come to a pause under this administration. And these boarding schools and residential schools pop up in the territories like Alaska, like Hawaii, and up in Canada, they're just under a different name with residential schools, and they're mostly run by the Catholic Church, and there's still a lot of atrocities. There was a movie that came out a couple of years ago called Sugarcane, if you've ever seen that. I think it's on Netflix, but it's really powerful. It can be a little bit hard to watch, but it's just a documentation of a young man from a community in British Columbia called Sugarcane, where he's trying to understand understand what happened to his father, because his father didn't know where he came from, because he was found in an ice cream container and he was saved as a young baby right before they were going to throw him in an incinerator. And the movie uncovers how the priest was basically getting these young girls pregnant, and then they would force them to have the babies, and then they would discard of the babies. And so it's a really dark movie, but it's also what we had to live with in Indigenous communities, because like my mom doesn't talk about boarding school because the pain and the trauma is still very fresh, even though that happened, decades ago now. And it's still very difficult for people to come to terms with this trauma. And we're still feeling that trauma in today's generations, because we're in a lot of our communities, that trauma keeps rolling through us. And we're still, there's a lot of domestic abuse and physical abuse and chemical and alcohol abuse and death and sexual abuse, and all these things are still rolling from this trauma point. So we really need to face it head on, because that's how we heal trauma, is by dealing with it and by understanding it and unpacking it so we can stop it from the next generations. But it's going to take a lot of work. Ignoring it is not the way to go through that. So it's a really important thing to learn about in American history, especially because this is a big reason why we don't have native restaurants everywhere. We haven't had a chance to barely catch our breath, let alone open up restaurants all over the place, right? And so in the 2000s, things didn't get much better for us. We're not even citizens until 1924. They also passed the Racial Integrity Act during that time period, because they tried to label us as just people of color. They were trying to strip away a lot of our treaty rights back then. We go through a couple of decades of Indian termination and relocation policies, which create large Indigenous communities in cities like Minneapolis, like Chicago, like Oakland, like Denver. But again, it was really difficult for people coming from tribal communities to move into the city at these time periods, even with these resources that were built, because things were still very, very racist and segregated back then in the 60s and 50s. And it was difficult for people to find jobs, and it just created more hardship, And so, there's reasons why some of our communities can be a little bit rough and a little bit tough, because of just how they were born, basically. We go through 3 decades of what's called the Indian adoption era, which the statistic is 1 out of 3 children were separated from their families. And just think about that number for 3 decades. So 1 out of 3 Native babies taken from their families and put into adoption services, into non-Native families. And that's just another form of cultural genocide that happened to Indigenous peoples. And so a lot of people who are my age and older, I'm 26, and they understand, they know a lot of people in the adoption services from the Native communities, and it was really difficult for people in those adoption services to find out where they came from, or to be reintegrated into those communities, because they grew up on the outside of them, And so that's just another thing. We couldn't vote until 1965, and we're still facing these massive voting situations, like the SAVE Act. I mean, what is that, right? Save what? So, we need to stand up for our voting rights. That's what makes us who we are, And we can't allow things like the SAVE Act to happen, because that's going to disenfranchise so many voters. And I know that our senators and our representation is fighting for that, but again, we have a lot of work to do, and it's an uphill battle to have the right to vote even this year. And we need to be aware that that's actually happening in real time right now. We can celebrate our own religions until 1978, which is in my lifetime. And so that drove a lot of our religions and culture underground, and there's still a lot of secrecy involved with a lot of Native cultures today, because if you were a knowledge holder of Indigenous cultures, you faced the fear and the real fear of being arrested, detained, violenced, unalived. All those things were very real for many decades, And so again, a country has always gone on about freedom of religion that just didn't apply to the first peoples that were here. And it's still, again, a very uphill battle for a lot of people. And so growing up in Native America as a youth, and I'm a chef now. Obviously, I get a lot of attention, and people always reach out, especially right before Thanksgiving. Everybody needs an Indian right at that moment, and I always get a lot of questions because they're like, you grew up on the reservation, you're a native chef, like tell us a story of what you ate, because they want to hear a cool story. They want to be like, well, I'd get up in the morning, I'd take down an elk with a slingshot I made, we'd gather a bunch of cool stuff and have a big feast, But, I grew up on a reservation, so I grew up in a colonized, segregated community, and that's what it was. So for me, like, this was what food was for me. Like, we didn't have access to what I'm serving at Awamini today, And so that's another big part of this, because I grew up primarily with Commodity Food Program food, which is a program from USDA, which, it's a lot of familiar things, because it's just a lot of the stuff that we see in the middle of the grocery stores and stuff that we serve kids at schools, right? But when I was growing up, there was just things like this, like beef with juices and chicken with juices, and it's that with juices that really makes those products pop, And so that's why it's what are indigenous food systems, And so you have to understand diversity to understand indigenous food systems, because there's so much amazing diversity. North America is massively diverse, right? And one way to see the indigenous diversity is to look at language maps. So if you look at a language map, you can see like there's so much amazing, cool diversity everywhere. And this is also very generalized, because there's a lot of other dialects and even other languages that are dotted in between there, because we didn't have solid lines saying this is US, this is Mexico. We just had amazing indigenous diaspora and diversity everywhere. And so it's really important to understand that, because today's world, we still have 634 tribes in Canada that are federally recognized, 574 in the US. 228 of those those tribes are all up in Alaska. And in Mexico, over 20% identify as indigenous, but you can just see it in the DNA. They're obviously way more indigenous than they are anything else, It's just part of who they are. So these colonial lines don't really matter, because they crossed us as indigenous peoples, And there's just really no comparison between these colonial settler lines and the indigenous diversity that's out there, because there's so much to think about. And that's what we try to explore with the new cookbook, Turtle Island, is just looking at all of this amazing, beautiful diversity no matter where you are. Because today's world, you can still, like if you drive across America, stop at a restaurant, every menu starts to taste the same, because it's the same burger, the same Caesar salad, the same appetizers, like everything is kind of the same, right? And we should really be celebrating our wonderful and beautiful regional and cultural diversity that still exists across these land spaces. So there's so much more to explore, and we just have to remember that English is a foreign language here, And so I like to focus on indigenous education, because part of our work is, food sovereignty, but it's also educational sovereignty, because not everything has to have a Eurocentric angle, because there's massive cultures and communities all across the globe, and we have so much to look at from different perspectives, and there's different lessons to learn from different people. And so when I started learning about indigenous everything, like there's so much to learn, I realized I'll never get to the end of this, and that's fine. It's a lifetime worth and more of learning. And so there's so much amazing stuff to learn about. So indigenous knowledge bases include all of these things: wild foods, permaculture, agriculture, seed saving, seasonal lifestyles, ethno-oceanography, hunting, fishing, whole animal butchery, mycology, salt, sugar, fat productions, crafting, land stewardship, cooking techniques, metallurgy, indigenous history, star knowledge, traditional medicines, food preservation, fermentation, nutrition, health, spirituality, gender roles, and so much more. There's so many topics of indigenous knowledge to think about, right? And so culinary knowledge is fun, because people can identify with food. Food is a language that we all carry as humans. We all have that common connection, because we all like to eat. Not all of our kids like to eat, but we all like to eat food, right? And so it is a connection point for us, and it is something that makes us curious about other cultures and learn about other cultures. Think about the first time you had sushi and want to learn about Japanese food, or the first time you try Ethiopian food, or anything. Like, it just opens up so many doors of curiosity, and people will sit and listen because people love food. And so we use food as a tool. So going through indigenous foods is pretty easy. Proteins, anything moving you can eat. I don't really, just don't do it, but you can. Like, anything that's moving around can be food if you really wanted it to be. But there's so much out there, and then we shouldn't be afraid of things because if it's not a cow, a pig, or a chicken, because those animals didn't even exist in North America not that long ago, and there's so much more to explore out there, right? And so it's important to just think about, like, there's a ton more protein choices than what we see on our typical menus, right? And even insects. This is from Oaxaca. If you've never been to Oaxaca, like, it's so normal to find in the markets just massive amounts of insects, and it's all over the menus, and it's so normal. People love it, you know? And you can make things taste good. You know, we put crickets on Owamni's menu, and we go through like 15 pounds of crickets a week, and that's a lot of crickets. Like, think about how much one dried cricket weighs, and think about 15 pounds of those, right? And so plant knowledge for me was really what I used to kind of reconnect with my ancestry, because I knew my ancestors had a vast knowledge of plants, because plants give us everything. It's lodging, it's crafting, it's medicine, it's tools, it's weapons, it's stories, it's food. Like, there's so much that plants give us, and having a larger plant knowledge helps you in general, because you just have to stop calling everything a weed if you don't know what it is. That's just, you know, it's lazy. Like, you just like start to learn some of the names of things. You know, there's so many cool plants around us everywhere. And I like to think about, like, we're humans and we need certain building blocks to survive, right? And so we have to get energy typically from carbs or fats, and so, like, or a blend of them, you know? So like our tribe, like, sure, we hunted a lot of bison, but we also harvested a lot of these prairie turnips called timsilo, which was a really amazing carbohydrate for us, and it still grows here in Minnesota. And we have other carbohydrates like camas root in the Pacific Northwest and Great Basin and in parts of California, or here in Minnesota, where we have this really beautiful wild rice that we should be protecting, because the waters are getting warmer in the southern edges and it's not liking that warm water. And so, like, we're going to be losing capacity. That's just a reality, you know, and we should be doing everything we can to be keeping these mining companies out of destroying some of these natural resources, especially for some tribal regions that are still utilizing this as major food sources throughout the entire year, you know? And just that knowledge of water plants in general, if you lived in a coastal region, there's so much food off the shores. And again, like, the tribes knew about all that stuff because they had thousands of generations of knowledge of what to do with everything around them. Or even in the deserts where all the plants look like they want to hurt you and maim you, you know? It's important just to think about that, because, like, I don't even like using the word food desert, because if you're an indigenous community who lives in the desert and you look outside, you see nothing but food, because you just knew how to look at the world through that lens, right? So when I think of a food desert, I think of one of the suburbs, because, like, it's just the same fast food choices all over again, right? And so agriculture is a massively important thing to think about, because there's just so much cool agriculture. And, you know, we're taught like this, we're kind of at the height of our technology, but we know how dangerous this is. And now they're saying they don't have to label things if it's got glyphosate. We've already been microdosing glyphosate for 20 years. Like, what's going to happen to us as we continue to do that, right? And we should be very worried if we see things like how worried should you be if glyphosate was found in your Cheerios? Like, you should be very worried. Like, we shouldn't be microdosing glyphosate, but you can't get away from it. It's just in almost everything, you know? And so native agriculture has massively spread throughout the Americas. This is a map where everywhere that agriculture was. And so, you know, starting at the bottom of Mexico with corn culture and moving both directions, but carrying so much amazing technology around agriculture all over the place. And we do learn about how a lot of the British settlers, when they were coming over, English settlers, that they were learning agriculture from the tribes because they didn't know how to survive in these land spaces, right? And now the crops that were being grown indigenously here are utilized all over the world as major sources of everything, with corns and beans and squash and chili peppers. Like, those things are all over the place in the world today, you know? And we were just down in Mexico City and touring the Chinampas, and there was so much diversity of how people were growing foods out there. And there's just so much cool stuff to learn from indigenous communities who had so much diversity in figuring out how to farm, you know. And what was Mexico City? They were feeding hundreds of thousands of people, and they didn't need chemicals to spray on their lawns, right? They were able to feed people and make people really healthy with what they were growing, and keep their water extremely clean on top of all of that. And figuring out how to farm in the middle of the desert and irrigate those farms. You know, this is a Zuni farm in New Mexico, and they used a waffle system. Or there are Three Sisters systems that were used on the East Coast, where you grow the corn and the beans will add nitrogen to the soil and strengthen the corn plants, and the squash will protect other plants from growing in it. And this is a picture of North Dakota with a Hidatsa woman named Buffalo Bird Woman. There's a really cool book called Buffalo Bird Woman's Garden that I'm sure is in the library that you should check out. And but it's an amazing story because it's her memories of growing up a Hidatsa woman and how they ran their gardens and farmed throughout the whole season before they ever saw European tools. And she's using a buffalo shoulder bone hoe and antlers for rakes, and they're using a row system, and they're growing the same things they were deep in Mexico, just different varieties that had changed over time, right? And so it's cool to think about all these heirloom varieties of things that are out there, and we should be protecting them with everything we have. So I've been on Seed Savers Exchange Board for about 11 years now, and it was really important for my journey to be closely connected to a lot of Indigenous seed keepers out there, and people who have they're keeping those stories alive, because we should be doing everything we can to keep those seeds in the hands of Indigenous peoples, because there's so much diversity to protect, and they're in danger still because there's a lot of these big chemical and medicine companies that are trying to trademark a lot of these heirloom varieties for themselves because it's just a move for power, And so, so we should be doing everything we can to push for more community gardens and permaculture, and, lawns are fucking stupid. Like, we need to really focus on things that matter. And so, I'm going to skip through this part real quick, but really, we just really want to get foods back to people. So I just want to talk about our vision with Natives really quickly, because then I want to take a few questions. But Natives is a 501c3. We just moved into the Seward Creamery building, and we're getting that all set up. It's a beautiful space. And we had the Indigenous Food Lab open in Midtown Global Market, and we're still doing a lot of food production there, and we're doing a lot of distribution because we have Indigenous Food Lab Market. So the model we created has our market and distribution. We've found over 80 different Indigenous producers around the United States that we feature. You can order a lot of those online depending on what's available. We have production kitchens that we're opening up where we can also use as training and food relief. We have our Indigenous Education Studio. If you go to YouTube and find Indigenous Food Lab, there's over 200 educational videos already, and that just lives out there, so everybody can watch those videos and learn about Indigenous education. We have been doing a lot of Indigenous food service development for like starting a restaurant, because Awamni is a part of our nonprofit. We use the restaurant as a tool. The restaurant doesn't serve a purpose for food relief or food access, but what it does do is create a lot of jobs, because we've maintained 100 employees at Awamni. A large amount of our staff are Indigenous. We move a ton of food dollars towards Indigenous producers because of our priority from purchasing from Indigenous first. So we move about $500,000 a year just out of that one kitchen to Indigenous food producers alone, which is a big number. And now at the Seward building, we're launching a program called Meals for Native Institutions, which is going to be creating foods for schools and hospitals to really impact the access that's out there. Because a lot of the rural schools, or any schools really, a lot of their food is just coming from these big corporations like the Cisco's and US Foods and Aramarks and Sodexo's. And we want people to have access to healthy, native, cultural, appropriate foods too. So that's why we're just going to start making the foods in these large formats. So it's just really important for us to push these food dollars to the Indigenous producers and grow these economies that haven't always had equal footing in the economy in general. And so our first model is obviously finishing up here because we have the restaurant, Awamni, which is obviously moving to the Guthrie, and I'm sure you guys are excited about that. We're planning on opening in May. And but again, that's going to create more jobs because we're doubling the size of our restaurant. We're going from a 78-seat restaurant to a 204-seat restaurant. So I'm sure some of you have had a hard time getting a reservation at Awamni because people are always like, "How do you get a reservation?" I was like, "I don't know. I just grew up on one." But our goal is to expand, so we're getting ready to build what we built here in Bozeman, Montana this year, and so we're getting ready to hire a regional director. We're starting to do some work in Rapid City, and we also have some funds to start doing the same work up in Anchorage. But the goal is to basically do this all over the place, to create regional center points and hubs all over the U.S. And eventually we can cross colonial lines. We can be up in Canada and the U.S. We might get kicked out of here anyway, so it'll be fine. But we see a world where we can help decolonize. We can help push back against what colonization has normalized in our lives, and think about better ways. Think about taking care of the earth. Think about protecting our water. Think about not giving everything to the billionaires. No offense if you're billionaires, but we have a lot of work to do. There's a lot of mouths to feed. There's a lot of land to take care of. There's a lot of water to protect. And we can do this with Indigenous knowledge bases out there. And because we just really believe that the future will be Indigenous, but we have to work together. It's not something one person or one group can do. It's something that we collectively have to do together, because there's, again, so much value to learn from Indigenous knowledge bases. And that's why we're excited about Turtle Island, because it was just barely scratched the surface. You know, when we turned in the manuscript, that we had 220,000 words plus in that manuscript, and we had to cut it down. So this is a little bit of a slimmed down version of what you got, but it's still an amazingly beautiful book, and we're very proud of it. And it was a lot of work, and I wish Kate was here, because she lives here in the cities too. And but yeah, we put so much effort into this book, and we launched it to great success in November, and we did great in the holidays, and then January was a turn. But we're excited for what we're doing, and we just want people to invest in and understand more about Native foodways and Native organizations. And so that's my time. I'm a little bit over, but I wanted to save a little bit of time for Q&A. So thank you guys for listening to that. Thank you. We're also going to be signing some of the books. I know there's still some available out there, yeah, we're very, very proud of that book, because a book like that hasn't ever been written before, to really look at all of North America, erasing those colonial lines, looking at all this amazing, beautiful Indigenous diversity, and just challenging ourselves to create recipes that would represent every region uniquely, and talk about some of the cool people who are out there doing cool stuff. And there's so much in that book, and we do expect it to get banned in Florida, so maybe get it here. But thank you guys for listening. So let's do some Q&A, right? All right.
Thank you so much, Shawn, for that rich and informative presentation. It's one we needed to hear for sure. My name's Rob Gowdy, and it's my pleasure to join tonight's presentation as the Q&A moderator. I'm the events director for Friends, and we're so happy you're here. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and I will bring the microphone to you. Anyone want to kick us off? Sir, I saw you first.
Great presentation, thank you.
Thank you.
Somali people have this thing, I can't think of the name. Right up to your mouth. Sambusa, that they're distributing through the schools. And you just mentioned that you're going to try to develop something like that. So is there some kind of something that you think you can distribute through schools on a mass basis?
Yeah, absolutely, because we have this beautiful large commissary kitchen at that Seward Creamery building, and we just got all of our equipment put in, and we're just getting our licensing squared away. But our goal is to make these recipes that are built for schools and hospitals, so they can just heat and serve healthy Native food recipes. So they could be wild rice dishes, soups and stews and things like that, sides. And we're actually modeling it after how the Minneapolis Public School has done it. So we're using the same kind of format of using these food service bags that are about 5 pounds that we pack with food, and we're able to freeze those, and we can ship them anywhere. And because we just want to get this to all the schools so they can start to, put some of these food choices into those menus across the schools, and universities can use them. Anybody really that's feeding a lot of people could utilize these. And so that's the plan. And then that was the quickest way for us, because originally when we set up Natives, we thought we'd set up these kitchens so we could train and develop other cooks and chefs, but not everybody has the time or skill levels to get trained up to learn how to cook food from scratch, from like healthy foods, and a lot of times they don't even have access to some of this stuff. So this will be easier to just make the food kind of style that they're already using in those school systems. So all they have to do is just heat and serve recipes, and we can add extra recipes on top of those bases so they can build on top of them too. And so we just see that as an easy way to turn food access on rather quickly. So we're going to start, we're pretty much ready to start making those foods right now. So we have a team that's ready to roll, and we're going to implement that into Montana basically sometime this year too. And so we'll be firing off centrally here in Minnesota and Montana, and covering those 2 regions, but eventually we're just going to keep figuring out how to grow that food access out there.
Hi. I'm curious to hear about your personal palate journey, going from highly processed white bread, lunch and meats to when you went through that journey of tasting the flavors and textures of Indigenous food.
Yeah, I think I've always just been curious with food ever since. I mean, I've liked food since I was born. I know that as a fact. But I feel like I I was always just kind of an open and adventurous eater. I was always willing to try stuff, and especially when I got into restaurants, it just because we grew up very poor, and when I worked in restaurants, I had food all around me. All of a sudden, I got to try things that I never got to try at home. And when I moved to the cities, there was just so much more food to try. Like I knew nothing when I came here. I felt like about food, and I didn't go to culinary school. I used to, when I got my first chef job, I was very poor still, and I didn't have money to buy cookbooks, but I would go down to the Barnes & Noble in Uptown at the time when it was in Calhoun Square, and I would just hang out there a couple hours before work and pull cookbooks off their shelf and read them and make notes and then put them back. That was like my little cookbook shelf. But, so I was just very curious, and I came from a generation where we did read books, and I did learn from books, I still learn from books. And so that was, for me, as I traveled, I was always very curious about the food of where it might be, So if I was in northern Italy or Belgium or wherever, I'd be really focused on like, where am I and what is the food that came from here and what's the story behind it? And that mentality helped me kind of peel back the layers to try to understand indigenous foods, But we're not trying to cook traditional foods. Turtle Island is really a book about the future. It's a book of what's possible if we accept the challenge of including indigenous perspective into our culinary knowledge.
Hi, Shawn.
Hi.
As a political writer, I find politics is in everything.
Yeah.
So could you extrapolate your love or hate for the Maha movement and what fears and what aspirations it brings?
I don't think they know what they're doing, but that's a personal opinion. I feel like, obviously, sure, you can turn a food triangle upside down, but I feel like there's more we can do, And I feel like there's such a thing as culturally appropriate diets too. And so not everybody eats the same things, and that's true with the same with indigenous peoples across North America. Not everybody eats the same things. Like some foods are forbidden for some tribes where they're celebrated for other tribes, for example. But it's like that across the world, So we should really be considerate of the diversity of cultures that we have in America. We should really be understanding how bad microdosing glyphosate is, and we should be in labeling things that are dangerous like that, And we should be really focused on just because who's been to a Wamini before in this room? Good amount of you. Good job getting reservations. And but you would know, like, if you ate at a Wamini, like, you'd feel good when you walk out of there because there's no processed food. We're not using dairy or flour or cane sugar or even beef, pork, or chicken because we just wanted to make a statement. And it was a political statement on top of that this could be done, that we could create a world-class restaurant without ranch dressing. And I feel like we pulled it off pretty well. And we still have a long ways to go because we're getting ready to evolve the restaurant into something new again. But again, for health, we were very close with HHS and USDA during the last time around, but all that came to a standstill for obvious reasons. But we think that we would love to continue to help in that direction. We'd love to. I have a lot of issues with Commodity Food Program. I would love to rewrite that whole situation personally, And so I think that there's a lot of things, and whoever's in charge, I'm happy to talk to them, So I think, again, there's more we can do than turn the food triangle upside down.
What can I do to help?
If you're a billionaire, you can give us lots of money. But if not, really, it's just supporting. It's really being very supportive, and especially restaurants right now because we went through a very hard time in January, and restaurants are really struggling. Even like everybody, really. I don't think any restaurant could have survived a couple more months of what we went through, and so I think being very supportive of especially some of the more vulnerable restaurants that are out there, and just giving them support. Doing more takeout, going to some of the markets, or just picking up some of the foods to support some of those markets. Everybody needs that support right now, and that's something that we can do as a community just to continue to support those who got hit the hardest, And so there's a lot of businesses on Lake Street that were struggling. Somali Mall was almost completely shut down. The Hmong market was being cleared out. Like, all of these things were happening, and so there's a lot of places that we could push our food dollars to support to continue to contribute to our diversity here in the cities and our neighbors and our community. And so that's another piece. But it's all like, I think we did a pretty good job in Minneapolis of standing up to fascism, And so we have to continue that spirit. We have to continue to stand together, and we have to continue to stand for what's right, because I know that we know what's right.
We're in the dead center of the house here, Shawn.
All right.
Hi. If you were to speak to a room of 8-year-olds, what would you be saying to them?
I like having the foods there because I think being more hands-on with the kids is something that's really fun and important to do. I was on the board with Dream Old Health for many years too, which is a native farm in Hugo, Minnesota, just about an hour north of here, 45 minutes, whatever. And they have a youth program where they bring urban kids out to the farm throughout the summer, and they have a program so the kids get to see the whole thing grow from seed to harvest time, right? And they learn a lot about their cultures and everything, and it's a really cool program. But it's really great just to be able to pick something out of the ground and feed the kids. Because if you go to Awamni during the summertime and you walk around, we put little placards out by some of the plants so you can see the Dakota names. And that's just easy education of just get kids outside. Everybody's glued to their phones, and so we need more activity. We need more things that make them put their phones down, and we just get healthy food in their hands so they know the difference of what it feels like to eat good, cool food that they can make, even compared to going to McDonald's or something. So I think the more activity, the more hands-on activity, the better when it comes to the youth. And again, just get them outside.
We're about 3/4 of the way back here.
Hi.
Hi.
I would like to turn to your cookbook and ask for somebody who hasn't explored this, what recipe would you recommend we start with?
Well, if you have access to javelina, I guess you could start there. I'm teasing. There's a lot of stuff, as I feel like a lot of people will just start with the region that they're in, so I think just looking at, because a lot of the foods will make sense to where you might be, and they might feel a lot more foreign in some of the other areas. So I think a lot of people can just start with where we happen to be, because you're going to recognize we have these ingredients right here around us. I could figure out how to identify what a white cedar tree looks like, for example, and it's kind of fun to be able to play with some of those recipes. So that would be my recommendation, is just start where your home is, or if maybe you grew up on the East Coast or West Coast, maybe you want to learn more about some of those recipes. And so I think the book's kind of laid out like that, so you can just explore. Maybe if you're traveling around to different parts of North America, you can revisit that book and look at some of the recommendations and stories we wrote out for other parts of the continent. Yeah.
We have time for one more question, and before we do, I just want to remind everyone that the evening does not end here. We are stepping down to the other end of the bridge for a book signing following the talk. We do have our wonderful indie bookseller partner, Majors and Quinn, outside selling copies of Turtle Island. So please make sure you grab a copy of Turtle Island, get a copy signed. If you are in the overflow space, please hop in the signing line and talk to Shawn and get some FaceTime with him. Anyone have a final question? Well, I have one just in my back pocket. I did a little research, and Hennepin County Library does have copies of Buffalo Birdwoman, including e-copies. So why should people check out Buffalo Birdwoman?
Well, again, it's such a unique perspective because it's rare to find an indigenous perspective of agriculture, for say, in North America. And it's also even more rare to find that coming from a female voice, because rarely do native people make it into history books, let alone a female indigenous person. So I think it's a really unique and beautiful book. And there's even a kid's book that was written from it. So there's a cool, if you go to Birch Bark, you can find a copy probably there that's just the same, just for a kid, but a kid's version of it. But it's a beautiful story of her memories of the corns that they grew and the gardens that they grew and how they harvested things and how they protected things. And there's a lot of cool stories in that book, and how they, set up their food preservation systems with, setting up little cellars to put all their stuff in. And it's so detailed. It's such a cool book. And at the History Center here in St. Paul, they have a bunch of her personal tools in their archives, so I really wish, it would be really cool to be able to work with them and do a full exhibit of they have a lot of cool, indigenous food stuff from this region that they could really showcase and not just be stuck in the basement,
Shawn Sherman.
Thank you guys so much for coming out. I'll be outside signing books.